So that was a fun lesson for lesson 2. I like that example, and you guys did a great job with it. So now we're going to move on to another component, and pretty soon we're actually going to start digging into the Magento code. But these concepts are sort of the underpinnings of Magento. So all of these big areas we're discussing, and you could really look into them a lot more on your own. But a lot of these areas that we're discussing, you have to know that the system's there, that these are all in operation sort of underneath, in between, and around Magento. So on to the next thing, Magento's modularity and its module-based architecture. So yeah, we'll be looking at the different modules in Magento, just sort of a brief overview, and as well as really just the module structure. Because it's very important to Magento, and I'm sure you've seen it in other systems as well. So, like this slide here, we have, if you don't know, this is a car when you put all of this stuff together. And this is not unlike what we have with Magento. So you've got maybe 13,000 files, 13,000, 14,000, depends. And you have all of them, and when you assemble them together, well, you get this thing that you can drive around in. Yeah, it's the same kind of concept with Magento. So hopefully you understand that this is what we're talking about with modules. Now, what you could do is you could gather like components together, and maybe those things would make part of the car that on its own wouldn't really be useful, but again, they're related in function. Maybe you take the wheels and the axles, etc. You get the idea. So yeah, ta-da, we get this, instead of a big heap of parts. Sometimes you might feel like this is going on, but hopefully we'll help you get through the code so you can really make sense of all of these disparate files. So, all right, let's talk about module guidelines. So, some of you, again, who are familiar with other module systems, modular-based systems, are going to be able to recognize some of these. But you should always consider these, and these are very, very important to remember when you are making your own module. So, ideally, what happens is that a module, how a module functions sort of internally, isn't tied too closely with too many other things in the system. Basically, your module should know very little about other modules, and likewise. And any time that you need to sort of connect modules together, you should do that through some kind of interface. Well, that's what we mean by keeping your module opaque. And again, as a guideline, you shouldn't directly reference another part of the application or directly set up directly set a relationship with whatever it is that loaded the module. Let's see. Regarding these other things, I'll be responsible for managing their dependencies. Yeah, dependency injection is important. Magento, you can do this only very lightly. I mean, in some ways, you do have to set up certain relationships, and we'll look at that, and we'll look at the when to do that and what the things you should be aware of are when you're doing that. So, and I guess this last one is a big one. Modules should support being added and removed from the system in a pluggable fashion. This to quite a degree exists in Magento. There are a couple pitfalls. We'll be looking at an example of this actually when we get into attributes and database. And but in general, you should be able to activate, deactivate, and just entirely remove a module with very minimal effect on the system. So now that we've set the guidelines, let's talk about how Magento doesn't always follow these guidelines. So, Mage core. So in your file system, you have app code core, and then the Mage namespace, and then the core module. So you have a couple of core folders, basically, in a file path. So that's what I'm talking about when I'm talking about Mage core. App code core, Mage core. Magento, in order to run, depends on Mage core. That is basically the entire application. And most of the other parts and pieces in the system will extend from here or from the variant library. So obviously, if you were to deactivate the Magento core, well, I don't know that you could, but if you were to remove the Magento core, you would not have a functioning system. So that's one of the issues. I could never see a reason why you would want to deactivate the Mage core. So But just be aware that that's the main part of the system. The other thing is module initialization. So basically, just remember that your modules, their declaration files are always evaluated. So you can deactivate your module, and you can deactivate most of its configuration using your declaration file. And don't worry, we'll be looking at this, I believe, in the next lesson. But you have to be aware that if you had 10,000 modules in your system, the declaration file for each of those would end up being parsed. So yeah, and the other part of this is that, well, no matter what is going on in the execution scope, say you're just in the customer section and the only real thing that you care about at the moment is the customer object. Well, all of the other modules, their configurations that are, at least all the other modules that are active, their configuration has been evaluated, so the functionality is waiting there, and there's overhead there. This is basically saying that that overhead isn't context dependent. You're basically stuck with the whole of the system in every request scope. So again, as light as you can keep your install, there's no need to have extraneous modules in there. Another thing, code intersection. And this is basically when two pieces of code do the same thing. And you could also say it's also, and that would be in different modules. But you could also say that it's when two modules know about each other. I think both of those apply here. Two different meanings, but both of them apply. So then you have the admin HTML module. And this is one of the most unfortunate things in the code base of Magento. So these modules, which we'll be looking at in depth in just a minute, well, the nice thing is you've seen in the code how you've seen how they have the namespace, for example, Mage, and then under the Mage folder you have catalog, customer, sales, etc. Well, those are all the modules. There's also an admin HTML module, but unfortunately all it does is aggregate all of the other modules inside of itself. This was done really as based on an earlier limitation in Magento to get everything, all of the admin routes underneath the admin path. So which by default in Magento is admin. So site.com/admin. And that's why admin HTML module, in a way, contains all the admin functionality of all of the earlier modules. The cool thing is we can actually get around this now because there was a very simple and elegant fix that allows you to keep your admin HTML files under your module's directory, which is really how it should have been. So this is really unfortunate. We have a way around it, but you have to be familiar with how this exists. And we'll actually be building a complete admin view for a custom entity on Friday. So we'll actually show you what the newer implications, what the new implementations are for this in a module. And then the other thing, the last thing, is the design integration. So the design integration just simply means that oftentimes, if you need to change something functionally in your, if you have some sort of functionality, functional process inside of your module, inside of your PHP classes, well, you're probably going to have to be tying that to some sort of template in order for it to do anything. So. I think this one's a little obvious, but it's another thing to consider. So it's not just enough to change your to change a functionality in your PHP class. You may need to actually structurally change something in a template itself. All right. So any questions? Okay, good. So Zen framework. This slide serves a couple of purposes. One is to tell you that Magento uses the Zen framework. The other is to tell you that Magento is not a Zen framework application. Well, it's not a Zen framework MVC application. Magento has its own MVC implementation. It's full stack. but a lot of the components from the Zen framework are used. Another thing to always remember, though, is that a given release of Magento is going to be tied to a given release of Zen framework because it comes with the code base. So you always have to consider the functionality. Say you're familiar with Zen framework and you know you need something from 1.12. You can override Zen framework classes, but you have to do so carefully and just test it out. But just be aware that underneath Magento, the Magento application, you'll have, let's see, the Variant library and Zen framework are the two big libraries that sit underneath that. So these are, for 110, Enterprise 110, these are all the classes from Zen that are being used. And these are the big ones up here. And so you can be aware that these are always there for you to use, as well as the rest of the framework itself. If you need anything from Zen framework, all you need to do is just try and instantiate the class. The autoloader will be able to find it, much like you'd be used to with your own Zen framework application. All right, any questions? Okay. So, so hopefully you've come out of this lesson with an awareness of how your modules should be structured, and your basic principles for module development, and certainly the module limitations we're going to see. We're certainly going to see as we go through this, and then be aware, of course, Zen framework is there for you.